All right, so we're going deep on this whole predetermined change control plan thing. PCCPs, for medical devices. And especially how they're really shaking up healthcare tech. With all this AI stuff happening, I mean, for our risk and regulatory folks out there, you're probably thinking, oh, great, another acronym. What's the big deal?
Well, the big deal is pretty massive, actually.
Mm,
PCCPs could totally change how we think about device updates and improvements. Imagine companies like Apple just rolling out upgrades and new features without needing a full FDA review every time.
right, that's a game changer for sure. And we're not just talking about little tweaks here and there, are we?
Nope, not at all.
These are potentially big changes that could directly impact patient safety
hmm
and how well the device even works.
Yeah, exactly. It's like having this pre-approved roadmap for a continuous improvement, kind of like a living document, that lets companies make adjustments and enhancements, but make sure that the device stays safe and effective throughout its entire life cycle.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we've got a bunch of stuff to dig into today. We've got the FDA's draft PCCP guidance from back in April 2023, the final version, which just came out. And, to make it real, actual device submissions from Apple. They've used PCCPs for their hearing aid feature on the AirPods Pro and their sleep apnea notification feature.
It's pretty cool what Apple's doing, actually. They're applying PCCPs in two totally different ways. One's focused on the user experience, and the other is all about data-driven improvements to the core AI. It shows you how versatile this whole approach is.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, so let's start with the FDA guidance. The draft and the final versions are pretty similar overall, but there's some key differences. That really jumped out at me. The final version seems way more focused on transparency and keeping users informed.
For sure. That's a big takeaway. The final guidance specifically calls for clear labeling and instructions for use. That explain the PCCP and how those modifications are going to be rolled out. It's really all about making sure that patients understand how their devices might change over time.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, people have a right to know if their medical device is going to be automatically updated, right? And they should know what those changes actually are.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes beyond just informing users, too. The final guidance puts a much stronger emphasis on real-world monitoring. After those modifications have been made, companies need to have a solid plan in place for tracking any unexpected issues or adverse events.
Oh, wow. So it's not just make the change and hope for the best. It's really about proactive, continuous monitoring to make sure that everything stays safe and effective once the device is actually out there in the real world.
Exactly. And for our risk-savvy listeners out there, here's a critical point. The FDA isn't just suggesting PCCPs, they can actually require them. This authority comes from a recent change to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, specifically FDURA Section 515C.
So this isn't just a nice to have, it's potentially a must have for some devices. That's a pretty big shift in the regulatory landscape. What does it mean for companies that are maybe still on the fence about PCCPs?
I mean, they need to get familiar with this approach. And fast. The FDA is clearly sending a message. PCCPs are going to be key to their strategy for encouraging innovation while maintaining safety. It's a totally new way of thinking about device life cycles.
For sure. Okay, so let's get into how Apple's actually using these PCCPs. They took a really user-focused approach. With the hearing aid feature, the modifications they've planned out are all about making the user experience better and giving users more benefits.
One example that really sticks out is their plan to adjust the maximum gain limit. It basically means users can crank up the amplification if they need to. It's all about personalization, giving users more control over their experience.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's a great example of how PCCPs can enable this ongoing optimization based on
Right.
what users actually need and want. It's so much more dynamic compared to those traditional regulatory pathways where, even small changes can require a whole new submission.
Totally. And it's not just about more amplification either. Apple's also looking at expanding the frequency bandwidth of the hearing aid feature, so users could potentially hear a wider range of sounds, making the listening experience richer and more natural.
That's interesting. But with any change, there's always a chance of unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
Could wider bandwidth lead to some users feeling overwhelmed by too much auditory input, especially if they're not used to it?
That's definitely a valid concern. But Apple's PCCP addresses this by highlighting their rigorous software verification and performance validation testing. They're not just making changes and crossing their fingers, they're putting in the work to make sure it's safe and effective.
That makes sense. And importantly, they're not keeping users in the dark about these changes. Their PCCP outlines clear steps for updating instructions for use. and proactively informing users about any modifications. They're planning updates on their website, and even within the health app.
That kind of transparency is so important. It builds trust with users. It lets people understand how their devices are changing and make informed decisions about how they use them.
Okay, that makes sense. So now let's compare that with Apple's PCCP for their sleep apnea notification feature. Here, the focus shifts from user experience to like data-driven refinement of the core AI.
Right. Their plan is to retrain the AI model with more real-world data to improve the accuracy and reliability of sleep apnea detection. It's a common strategy with AI-powered devices. As more data comes in, the AI can learn and get better at its job.
So one feature is about making the user experience better directly, while the other is about tweaking the underlying data analysis to make the device's core function more accurate.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but it's important. It shows how PCCPs can be customized to the specific goals
And functionality of different devices.
Okay, so we've seen two different ways Apple's using PCCPs, both with the potential to
Yeah.
bring real value to users. But what do you think are the key factors behind their success so far? I think it comes down to a few things. First, they're seriously committed to rigorous testing. Like, they've invested a lot in verifying and validating their modifications, making sure they meet the highest standards of safety and effectiveness. That builds confidence, for the FDA and for users, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And second, they've really embraced transparency. They're going above and beyond to keep users in the loop about changes, providing detailed documentation and clear updates. That builds trust, too. It's just so important when you're talking about medical devices that people really rely on.
Yeah, it's almost like they're saying, hey, look, we're constantly working on making our devices better, and we're going to be totally upfront with you about how we're doing it.
Exactly. And that approach fits perfectly with the FDA's final PCCP guidance. They're not just following the rules, they're setting a new standard for how to do PCCPs right, effectively.
And responsibly. That's awesome. So Apple's example is inspiring and all, but let's bring it back down to earth for a sec. What does all this mean for our listeners who are risk practitioners? Like, how can they actually use PCCPs to their advantage?
Well, the first thing is, risk practitioners need to be part of developing the PCCP from the very beginning. It's not something you just tack on at the end. It needs to be baked into the whole device development process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're talking about working closely with the engineering team, regulatory affairs, the clinical team. It's a very collaborative thing.
Definitely. And risk practitioners bring a unique perspective to the table. They can help spot potential hazards early on and make sure that the PCCP includes ways to reduce those risks.
So they're not just reacting to risks after the fact. They're actually shaping how the device evolves over time.
Exactly. They're helping to design a system that anticipates risks and manages them, which ultimately makes it smoother to implement updates and modifications.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's get more specific. The FDA guidance talks about three key parts of a PCCP: the description of modifications, the modification protocol, and the impact assessment. Where should risk practitioners focus their energy within these parts?
Well, the description of modifications, that's where you'll find all the nitty-gritty details of the plan changes. It's super important for risk practitioners to really look at those modifications and think critically about how they could impact the device's safety and effectiveness.
So they're like detectives, looking for clues.
Right.
That could lead to problems down the road.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. They need to be asking questions like, are these modifications creating new hazards? Are they increasing the likelihood or severity of existing hazards?
It's about spotting those potential problems before they become real problems. Okay, so that's the description of modifications. What about the modification protocol? What's important there from a risk perspective?
The modification protocol basically says how the changes will be implemented and validated. This is where risk practitioners need to make sure that the methods are solid and will actually address the risks that have been identified.
We're talking about things like verification and validation testing, right?
Yeah.
Making sure those changes actually do what they're supposed to do and don't create new problems.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just testing. The modification protocol should also talk about the data management practices that'll be used. This includes how training data for AI models will be collected, curated, and protected from bias.
Because biased data can lead to AI models that are messed up, which can compromise both safety and effectiveness.
Exactly. And this is a big area where risk practitioners can contribute. They can help make sure that those data management processes are strong and will give reliable results.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's the impact assessment. This sounds like it's about connecting all the dots and putting the pieces together
Yeah, that's right. The impact assessment is where you look at the overall benefits and risks of the PCCP and come up with a solid plan for mitigating those risks. Risk practitioners are super important here, making sure that all the potential risks have been thought through and addressed.
So it's not just about identifying risks in isolation. It's about understanding how they all work together
Right.
and coming up with strategies to manage them in the context of the whole PCCP.
Exactly. This requires a deep understanding of the device itself, the plan changes, and how those could impact users and patients. It's where all the threads of the PCCP come together.
Okay, so we've talked about how risk practitioners can be involved in each piece of the PCCP. But zooming out a bit, how do you see the role of the risk practitioner evolving as PCCPs become more and more common?
I think PCCPs are a big opportunity for risk practitioners to become more strategic and influential within their organizations. Traditionally, risk management has often been seen as reactive, something you do after the engineers have already designed the device.
Yeah, it's like putting out fires instead of preventing them.
Exactly. But with PCCPs, risk practitioners have the chance to be involved from the start and shape how the device evolves over time. They can become proactive partners in driving innovation while making sure things stay safe and effective.
So it's about moving from a check-the-box mentality to a more holistic approach to risk management.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the companies that embrace this shift are the ones that are going to thrive in this new era of PCCPs.
Now, I want to go back to Apple for a minute. We talked about their general approach to PCCP.
That's fair.
But let's get into the details of the hearing aid feature and the sleep apnea notification. What can we learn from their submissions?
Okay, so the hearing aid feature. Like we said, it's all about making the user experience better. Their PCCP lays out 3 specific modifications they're planning to implement: adjusting the maximum gain limit, expanding the frequency bandwidth, and adding environment-specific programs.
Those sound like features that users would actually get excited about.
Yeah.
But let's break each one down and talk about the potential benefits and risks from a risk management perspective.
Sure. Adjusting the maximum gain limit means users can get more amplification if they need it, which could be huge for people with more severe hearing loss. But there's also the risk that too much amplification could damage someone's hearing.
Yeah, it's that classic risk-benefit analysis. You're trying to find the sweet spot where you maximize the benefit without creating unacceptable risks.
Exactly. And Apple's PCCP addresses this risk by having a really strict testing protocol to make sure that the amplified sound levels stay within safe limits. They're showing that they've thought about the downsides and have a plan to deal with them.
Okay, what about expanding the frequency bandwidth? What are the potential benefits and risks there?
Well, expanding the frequency bandwidth means the hearing aid feature could capture and amplify a wider range of sounds. This could make speech clearer, especially in noisy environments, and also make the listening experience more natural and enjoyable for users.
That sounds great, but I can imagine that some users, especially people who are new to hearing aids, might find that overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a good point. The brain needs time to get used to processing a wider range of sounds. Apple's PCCP acknowledges this and emphasizes the need for user education and guidance on how to adapt to the expanded bandwidth gradually.
So it's not just about the tech itself, it's about how it's introduced and how users are supported.
Right. And that's something important for risk practitioners to keep in mind. It's not just about the device, it's about the whole user experience.
Now, the third modification, adding environment-specific programs. That sounds really interesting. How would that work in practice?
So imagine your AirPods automatically adjusting their settings based on where you are. You're in a loud restaurant. The hearing aid feature boosts certain frequencies to make it easier to hear speech. You walk into a quiet library. The settings adjust to reduce background noise and give you a more subtle listening experience.
Wow, that's pretty cool. It's like having a personalized sound engineer in your ear. But what if the device gets it wrong? Like, what if it misinterprets the environment?
That's a risk, for sure. If the device misidentifies the environment, it could use the wrong settings, which could be jarring or even disorienting.
So how does Apple's PCCP deal with that risk?
Their PCCP has a really strong validation plan to test how accurate and reliable the environment detection algorithm is. They need to show that it's making the right adjustments at the right time.
So again, it comes back to testing and validation. It seems like that's key for successful PCCPs.
It definitely is. You can't cut corners when it comes to safety and effectiveness.
Okay, now let's talk about Apple's sleep apnea notification feature. We mentioned that their PCCP for this feature is all about using data to refine the AI model. They want to retrain the model with more data to make it better at detecting sleep apnea. But this raises some interesting questions. From a risk management point of view,
Oh, for sure. One big question is, how do they make sure that this retraining doesn't introduce bias or actually make the model less accurate?
right? Because if the data they're using to retrain the model is bad, the results could be unreliable
Yeah.
or even harmful.
Exactly. And their PCCP addresses this head on. They've got a very specific data management plan. It described how they'll collect, curate, and protect the data used for retraining.
So it's about making sure the data they're using is as clean as possible
Yeah,
and unbiased.
right. Their plan involves collecting data from a diverse group of users. So the data set represents the actual patients who will be using the device. They're also putting in place really strong quality control measures to find and get rid of any potential sources of bias in the data.
It sounds like they're being very proactive about data management, which is so important with AI.
Definitely. And it highlights another key role. For risk practitioners in the world of PCCPs, they need to be experts in data management and understand how to assess the quality and reliability of data that's being used to train and refine these AI models.
It's like a whole new set of skills that risk practitioners need to learn.
It is, and it shows how the whole risk management profession is changing as technology becomes more complex and data-driven. Risk management needs to keep up.
Okay, now I'm curious. We've talked a lot about Apple, but are there other companies out there that are using PCCPs successfully?
Oh, absolutely. Apple is definitely a leader. But they're not the only one. One good example is Caption Health. They develop AI-powered ultrasound software. They got FDA clearance for PCCP for their caption guidance software, which helps healthcare providers do cardiac ultrasounds.
That's really interesting. What kind of modifications does their PCCP cover?
Well, their PCCP covers modifications to the AI model that could improve the accuracy and efficiency of cardiac ultrasound exams. For example, they might retrain the model with more data to make it better at identifying specific cardiac structures or to give more precise guidance to the user.
So it's similar to Apple's sleep apnea notification feature in that it's focused on improving the underlying AI model.
Exactly. And just like Apple, Caption Health has put a big emphasis on data management and risk mitigation in their PCCP. They've got clear procedures for collecting and curating training data, as well as for monitoring the software's performance in the real world.
It's great to see more companies embracing PCCPs and showing how they can be used to drive innovation in medical devices. It seems like this approach could really change the industry.
I think so too. PCCPs offer a more agile and responsive way to develop and improve medical devices, which ultimately benefits patients.
Yeah, that's the goal. But it's not without its challenges, right? What are some of the hurdles companies might face when they're trying to implement PCCPs effectively?
One of the biggest challenges is just the sheer complexity of developing and implementing a solid PCCP. It takes a lot of collaboration across different teams within the company, which can be tough to achieve.
Yeah, like we've been saying, you've got engineers, risk managers, regulatory affairs, clinical teams. All these different groups need to be on the same page and working together smoothly.
Right. And that requires clear communication, shared goals, and a willingness to adapt and adjust.
What other challenges are there?
Another one is the need for ongoing data collection and analysis. PCCPs rely on real-world data to inform those modifications and improvements.
So companies need to have the infrastructure and the expertise to collect, curate, and analyze all that data.
Exactly. It's not just about having a good idea for a modification. It's about having the data to back it up and to show that it's actually working.
And then, of course, there's the challenge of being transparent with users, which the FDA has made clear is really important.
Definitely. Companies need to find a way to communicate effectively with users about how their devices are changing and how those changes might affect their experience. They need to do it in a way that's easy to understand.
It's a tough balance, giving enough information to be transparent, but not overwhelming users with technical details.
For sure. And that's where good communication and user experience design come into play.
Okay, so PCCPs have this amazing potential for innovation, but they also need a real commitment to strong processes and thoughtful execution.
That's a great way to put it. PCCPs aren't a magic solution. They're a tool that needs to be used carefully and expertly.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of using PCCPs in other industries besides healthcare.
Oh yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We've been talking about medical devices, But the ideas behind PCCPs could be used in lots of other industries where technology is changing quickly and there's a need for constant improvement and updates.
It's a really interesting thought experiment. Can you give us some examples of other industries where PCCPs might be a good fit?
Sure, think about self-driving cars. The software that controls those cars is always being refined and updated. As more data is collected, a PCCP-like approach could streamline the regulatory process and allow companies to make safety-critical updates faster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in an industry like that, where the technology is moving so fast. We definitely need a more agile and adaptable regulatory framework.
Absolutely, and it goes beyond just self-driving cars. Think about financial technology, where algorithms make investment decisions, or assess credit risk, or cybersecurity, where software needs to constantly evolve to stay ahead of threats.
So the possibilities are huge, but I imagine there would be unique challenges in adapting PCCPs to these different industries.
Oh, for sure. Each industry has its own regulations and its own set of risks and concerns. It wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all solution.
But it's a really cool thought experiment, isn't it? Imagining how this approach could be used to speed up innovation and improve safety across all these different sectors.
It is, and it shows the need for ongoing discussion and collaboration between regulators, industry leaders, and risk management experts.
It's about finding that balance between fostering innovation and making sure things stay safe.
Exactly, and that conversation is only going to get more important as technology keeps advancing at this pace.
Well, this has been a really great deep dive into PCCPs. We've covered a lot, from the FDA guidance to real-world examples, to the potential challenges and opportunities.
It's been great exploring this with you. I always enjoy these deep dives into these complex and ever-changing areas of regulation.
And for our listeners who want to learn more about PCCPs, we'll put links to all sources we talked about in the show notes.
And stay tuned for more deep dives in the future as we continue to unravel the ever-changing world of risk management and regulation in the face of all these incredible technological advancements.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into PCCPs. Until next time.
See ya.